Margaret is in a wheat field looking for her daughters as they laugh and hide from her in a game. However, the giggles soon turn to fits of cough as a sandstorm brews up and attacks them. Margaret cannot find herself to help them until she wakes up with a jolt. The time is 1933, and Margaret is currently living in a village in Oklahoma in drought with her remaining two daughters, Rose and Ollie. Her husband Henry has gone away for a job, and the rest of the family awaits the money he sends to take the train and go live with him rather than living on this dry land. Margaret seems to be getting obsessed with cleaning with house and not leave a speck of dust to protect her daughters. However, it seems like she already lost one in the process. Rose wants to go to her father, so Margaret tells her if the crops come in, they can take the first train out. Margaret tries to make the house, especially the girls' room, as airtight as possible to not let the dust enter before she goes to sleep. However, she also asks Rose to lock the door behind her for some reason. On a usual night, Rose decides to read The Gray Man to Ollie, a story about an entity that is not human. It appears out of nowhere and then disappears in thin air. It is known to seep through cracks and holes into houses, and people can breathe it in. Once they do, he makes them do terrible things. In her room, Margaret cleans the surface of her dressing before taking some pills. She recalls Henry offering for the entire family to go, but Margaret didn't want to leave her daughter Ada's grave alone. The next day, Margaret and the girls walk to another house through the dust and dry atmosphere. The neighbor, Esther, has her house covered entirely in dust, while worrying about her little one catching severe pneumonia due to the dust and dry cold. Margaret gets even more obsessive as she keeps checking her house for the slightest of dust. She seems to be living a monotonous life, sleeping through pills every night, and then waking up after a dusty nightmare to check if her girls are breathing properly. Later, the churchgoers in the embroidery session talk about an intruder entering one of the village homes and brutally killing the wife and child in front of the tied man. The intruder killed the drifter as he came in from nowhere and disappeared into thin air later. On the way back, Margaret finds Esther trying to leave the village during a sandstorm and warns her, but Esther is done with the place. Reaching back, Margaret and Rose are closing the doors and windows when Ollie sees a shadow in the storm appear and disappear. She hides in the closet and later tells Margaret, making Rose get an earful for scaring her sister with that creepy mythical story. However, the next morning, Rose screams about someone being out there, making Margaret take the gun and look around the house and in the open barn doors, but she finds no one. Around that time, people find Esther's cart flipped and her elder son dead in the piled sand nearby. Esther is also underneath the pile, but miraculously survives to live with the regret of her decision. While Thomas is being put out to the grave, Rose's nose starts bleeding uncontrollably. Margaret takes her to the doctor and gets to know it's the effects of the dry weather. It is also revealed that her pills have been prescribed to her for her betterment and aren't her escape. The following night, Margaret moves them all to the same room so she can use all the clothes to cover every creak in that room, even though her prescription says she shouldn't sleep around them. The next day at her hand embroidery class, Margaret gets to know that the services aren't available at the moment, so she might not receive Henry's letters for a while. Back at home, Margaret feels someone is in the upper portion of the barn and finds no one. She rushes back to get her gun, knowing there is an intruder around. Going back to the barn, she calls out for the person to come out. The girls also follow her, scared of being alone. A man soon comes out from under the wooden boards, claiming to be Henry's friend, Wallace, here to check on them. Henry's jacket on him is his identification, as he tells them he wanted his leg to heal before meeting them by knocking on their door, but the situation remains suspicious. Afterward, the guy mentions knowing how to make their cow produce again, and also how he can stop Rose's uncontrollable nose bleeding. After resisting a little, Margaret sees as he holds Rose's nose, and soon it stops bleeding completely. This makes her trust him, but also apologize as she cannot let a man stay in the house in Henry's absence. Wallace understands and tells her he'll lay low in this barn. It is exciting enough that the next day it rains, making it clearly show that his person is more than he seems to be. In the embroidery session, Rolls calls Margaret out, seeing little Jacob out alone doing his chores. She visits Esther and finds out she hasn't left the bed ever since, the blisters on her back showing so. Margaret comforts her with how this is unbearably painful, but another kid needs to be taken care of. However, seeing the blisters, Margaret has no choice but to tell the sheriff that Esther isn't fit to care for Jacob at the moment. When Esther realizes this, she lashes out at Margaret, telling her she's no different and will suffer the same fate. Later on, Margaret and Wallace are talking as they share details about life. She shares how Ada's death made her have episodes of sleep, and she'd do terrible things afterwards. Rose and Ollie tell Margaret that the emails have been opened, but they haven't received one yet. At night, everyone prays at the dinner table, after which Rose reveals that there did indeed come a letter from Henry. Ollie tries to snatch it, but Rose tells them she'll read. Wallace makes her sit on her lap as Rose reads how Henry misses them and the situation there. The last bit is for Margaret, where Henry mentions a bypasser staying with them overnight and stealing his jacket. The first letter he wrote to them, some money and sweets for the girls along with brutally killing Henry's bunkmate. Turns out the thief took hold of Ollie to threaten them to give the letter so there is no proof and give any money if they have, which they don't. Margaret manages to make use of sign language to save Ollie on cue. The letter gets into the man's hand and is burned, but he decides to leave. Not before haunting Margaret by telling them she can't escape the gray man as he seeps through the cracks and she'll breathe him in. That night, Margaret decides to stand outside and keep watch when she feels something in the barn. She goes there till Ollie calls her out. Margaret is surprised at Ollie speaking till Esther comes from behind and kills Ollie to make Margaret suffer the same fate as her. Margaret's painful scream is stopped when Rose pulls her out of her nightmare, and Margaret realizes she is still standing outside and it's morning already. The next few days, Margaret was extra obsessive about cleaning and their daughters, and still weird stuff happening at night, like the bed in the girls' room catching fire or furniture moving. Rose is confused when Margaret says it's Wallace, since she said the Grain Man wasn't real, and now she believes it. Esther visits Margaret, apologizing for her behavior. She is doing better and tells Margaret to get out and see everyone at the dance, since people are starting to talk about them being locked into the house for a long time. Knowing her girls can be taken away if she is questioned, she decides they should go to the dance and gives Rose a dress. However, as the girls are playing outside, she feels like Rose is choking and tears the dress to hit her back, only for Rose to scream she is fine and was just laughing. At night, Rose tells Margaret they don't have to go, or they can explain the Wallace situation, but fingers might be pointed at Margaret's mental state, so she says no. She cuts her leg to put some blush on her cheeks using the blood. The irony of calling herself sane moments before this. At the dance, Margaret panics seeing Rose and Sheriff talk, and goes there, but it is all good. The Sheriff and Margaret are dancing when everyone sees the blood on her leg. She says it's a small cut and is about to leave when Esther comes in. Margaret's hallucinations are getting out of hand as she sees him with Wallace when it's someone else. Esther had called some visitor a healer, and Margaret assumes it is Wallace, which makes her rant about the scenario at her house. Rose has to advocate so her mom isn't called mentally unfit. At home, Margaret is panicked about the girls being taken away when she ends up sewing her hand. Rose cleans both her wounds until the door is violently knocked. Margaret tells her to cover up the door and lock it while she goes out to deal with Wallace, ignoring Rose's call that it could be someone checking on them. In the heavy storm outside, she hears Wallace and Esther mocking her, but there is also a laced voice of Esther worrying about her. Seeing a figure, Margaret shoots it and panics, telling Rose, who came out, that the gray man is real and it vanished when she shot it. Rose is sent to lock the door and sleep, but she wakes up late to find the door open. Looking around, she finds Margaret outside, who assumes it is Wallace, and points the gun while Rose screams it's her and not to shoot. Margaret finally comes to her senses as Rose confronts her that she is the one haunting them, not the gray man. It seems like Margaret knows she's been acting up in her sleep again, and she just wants to stay together with the girls, including the dead sister Ada. Rose doesn't feel safe around her thoughts and rushes to lock the door. When Margaret enters through the other door, Rose takes Ollie and tries to run away, but Ollie resists. Rose rushes, hoping to call for help till she comes across Esther's shot-dead body. She goes back, confronting her mom when the door is knocked again. Margaret holds Rose from calling for help, but Ollie gets a gist of the situation and opens the door. The sheriff is there. Rose calmly gets up and tells him she is not fit for them. Sheriff tries to patiently talk to her, but the poor nice man gets stabbed to death by the mad lady. Rose has no option but to pick a knife and end this once and for all. Margaret is sitting on her dress talking about staying together for eternity with Ada. In simpler words, she wants all three of them to commit suicide so they can be together in peace. Rose starts crying about being tired of it as she nears her and hugs her. However, Ollie coming in makes her stop. She tells Margaret to mix the medicines in some food, which she gladly agrees to. When in the kitchen, she hears Rose scream that Ollie ran out in the storm. Panicked, Margaret goes out with a rope holding her to the door to come back. Breaking down, Rose takes the tough decision of cutting the rope and letting her mother wander off and die in the sandstorm for the sake of their lives. As Margaret feels helpless in the storm, she finds herself in the wheat field again, but this time, she finally reaches the girls she always heard giggles of when they were hiding, indicating an end to her misery as well. Later, the pained little girls take the train to go live with their dad, finally seeing what green grass and lively crops look like.